Now, before we start going into reporting services, such as creating your reports and seeing them in action, it's very important, first of all, just to go over some of the basics. This is a little bit of a techie video, but it is vital to understand all of these elements because this is reporting services. Now, if you are using SQL Server 2005, predominantly most of this video is still applicable. However, there are going to be some slight differences, so I'll tell you those as we get to them. So let's get to it. Now, how I got there was I went Start, Programs, SQL Server and Configuration, and then there was an option within there for reporting services. In 2005 it's slightly different, but you'll get to the same sort of configuration screen for reporting services. So the first thing it asks you is which server do you want to connect to. The reason it asks you is because you could have an enterprise network of SQL servers and you may need to point to a different one to configure it. Well, in our case it's my local one, which is called Media Server. So I'm just going to click on Connect, and it now gives us our information. So the first thing it shows us is the report server status, and it just tells us the name of the instance that we're on, what version of reporting services. That's quite important because there's certain things in the enterprise version of reporting services are present which aren't in the standard. The biggie, I'll tell you straight away, is data-driven subscriptions, which I'll discuss in a separate video because it warrants 10 minutes on its own, data subscriptions. But inside here it just tells us our typical things. The report server mode as well, native. You may be wondering what that is. You can actually incorporate reporting services into SharePoint. If you want to do that, then you have to change some of the settings, and at which point it will change from reporting server mode of native to SharePoint integrated. So we're not going to deal with SharePoint because it's not the purview of this training video. So that's just our general sort of information. We can stop and start the service if necessary. Well, I don't want to do anything here. I just want to now configure it. So let's go to the first option, which is service account. So what's this for? Well, basically, the whole purpose of this is to assign a particular Active Directory account to run this service. Now, you could just say, well, why don't I leave it on local system? Well, if it's just for your own internal use, for your own projects you may be doing at university, that's fine. On my home machine, I'm going to leave it on local system. But if you're on a network and you're working within a company, you're more likely to use another account. Now, why? Because quite often you would set up one Active Directory account to support all reporting services. This just means easier administration overhead. So you would actually put in your domain and user that you've been assigned for reporting services and the password. Now, what would happen is if I clicked on apply, is it would then get hold of that Active Directory account on this machine and configure it so it's allowed to be used, because there's a lot of options in the security policies that need to be enabled to allow the account to run properly. Whereas if you leave it in the built-in, they've already got that access because they are sort of kings of their own castle. If you're trying to do it for a domain, you would have to set up an account here, and then it would then deploy the appropriate permissions. So I'm going to leave that on built-in. There are other options in here, network and local service. I'm just going to leave it on local system. So what is the next tab? Well, we got web service URL. I'll just OK that because I fiddled with the screen. Web service URL, I'm going to skip for a moment. I'm going to jump down to report manager, then come back. The report manager URL, as you can see, it just says virtual directory is reports. That is the front end. That's where all your users would go in your web server. So if we go into Internet Explorer, you'll notice that I'm on the reports bit. I've just highlighted it there on the URL. It just says reports. So this is what we're looking at. So it's the front end, the nice GUI dash for all your end users to look at. Let's just jump back into the config. So what's the other one? The web service URL. That is where your reports get deployed. So when you've created your reports in Business Intelligence Studio, what you would do is you would actually deploy them to the report server, which we'll show on subsequent videos. But at this point, it's just important to understand the differences. Report server is just basically a location where you dump your files. Where you want to see it pretty, that's where the reports virtual directory comes in. And we also need to just discuss one other issue. In 2005, all of your reporting services structure was embedded inside Integration Information Services, which is the web server, if you will. In 2008, that's no longer the case. Now, you could be wondering, well, why did they change it? Well, the reason they changed it was purely down to clustering. IIS is not cluster aware. Now, if you're not familiar with what clustering is, it just basically means that you have a form of fault tolerance on your system. So you could potentially have two reporting services mirroring each other. So if one of them goes down, the other one will then immediately take over. So the end user doesn't notice a difference, even though behind the scenes one of the servers is on fire and billowing smoke, but the end user would not notice a difference. So that's the key difference. So SQL 2008 is cluster aware, and as a result of this, it no longer uses IIS. Instead, it has its own proprietary IIS system, which is what we're configuring within here. So if you've been looking in IIS in 2008 and saying, where's my report folder, where's report server, it's not there because it's not part of IIS anymore. So what are the other options down here? Well, IP address, I'm going to leave it alone, just basically meaning use the standard IP address that the computer's been assigned to. But what I've had to do on my machine is change the port number. Now the reason being is there's something pesky already running on port 80, which is IIS, which I've got used for other things. So what I've told it to do is put it on a completely different port number of 8081. Now you can type just about any number you can think of in here, but be careful not to make it clash with other ports. For example, port 25 is for your mail, port 21 is for FTP. If you're not sure, go and search on the web for port numbers and it'll give you an assignment of where things aren't getting used. So I've just chose port 8081 here. Now you could also put in an Ssl certificate, so you could actually secure it with the padlock. Again, I'm not going to do that, but if you did, you'll click on the drop down arrow with the certificates you've got installed and you could then apply them in here. But I'm not going to put my media center certificate on there because that would just be stupid. So what we've got then is at the bottom is it shows you what the URL is. So if I clicked on that, it would then bring it up. So going back to the report manager URL, you'll see exactly the same thing here. I've told it to go to port 8081, and how did I do that? I clicked on advanced and there you go. You would just edit it and off you go. So what else is in here? Well, we missed out database. Simply put, you're going to be deploying reports onto the server. Where is that report data going to sit? Well, it goes into a particular database called report server, and as you can see, there's our account again, local system, which is being used, which we could have changed up here in the service account section. So that's the basic database. So if you wanted to, you could actually change the database here, and also this is where you would also change it to go to SharePoint, which I'm not going to touch. So by and large, you shouldn't need to touch that. Things which you will need to configure is email settings. So after a default install, you will have your report server up and running. However, you would need to specify an SMTP server to put in an email address. So if you did set up schedules for your reports to send out information, they would need to have an email account associated, and this is where you would set it up. After that, you've got the execution account. Now, this is specifically for other additional things that you may have firing, which your standard account will not allow. So these are things like your scheduling and rendering options. You generally need to specify an execution account because if they're running overnight, you may not be present on the system. So you would generally specify an account. And again, you would choose an Active Directory account that you've been assigned or you've created to cater for that task. Now we come to the final two options, encryption keys. Encryption keys are very important. If I deploy a report, I may be storing inside it sensitive information such as login names and passwords. If I do that, then obviously I want to make sure that my data is encrypted so it can't be stolen. So it's very important that you back up the key because this key is specific to this computer. And as you can see, it's warning me at this moment I have not backed it up. So I should just back it up and I'll just choose a location. I'll just call it test. And I'll put a password in and then I'll OK, and now I've created it and it's backed up. So it's very important to back it up. And then the final option is scale out deployment. This is your clustering services. So if there were any other servers on the network, it would identify them at this point, and then you can add them, and then it automatically works out how to do the clustering. This particular screen is specific to 2008. You won't see it in 2005. So hopefully with these basic options covered, you get a better understanding of how it ticks behind the scenes. Now we can get on to the good stuff. Let's go and make some reports.